It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our next speaker, and I'm going to do it two different ways. First of all, here's the generic one. This is on the Sun-Times website. It's very compressed, right? It's very modest, almost as if Chris wrote it himself. Chris Fusco became editor-in-chief of the Chicago Sun-Times on October 2017. Before that, he served as the news organization's managing editor and was a Sun-Times reporter for 16 years, producing numerous investigative reports involving government corruption, crime, child welfare, transportation, nursing home care, and other subjects. Fusco is the recipient of more than a dozen local and several national journalism honors, including the George Polk Award for local reporting, which he shared with colleagues Tim Novak and Carol Marin in 2014. But since this is homecoming, and this is an IWU crowd, you have to hear the IWU introduction. All right. Chris began as a writer for the Argus in November 1991 and got a splashy page one byline because he tackled a difficult story on NCAA Proposition 48. You remember that?
I do remember that.
Well, the following year, he added sports columnist to his resume and wrote both game stories and sports columns for the Argus. Soon he began appearing on the masthead. The February 1993 Argus lists Chris as sports editor, but after that it's hard to keep up. From there he went on to be assistant editor, acting editor-in-chief. We were free with titles back then, weren't we?
We were really making everybody happy.
Everybody happy. And managing editor. While a student, he also worked as an intern at the Pantograph, and he also worked at IW News Services. He also won a few awards. In 1993, Chris won a first place award in headline writing and a third place award for sports story at the Illinois College Press Association. He won for an in-depth piece he did on gender equity issues in sports. Then in 1994, he won first place awards for sports column and general column, plus a shared third place award with Dave Brown.
Dave Brown, now the managing editor.
Now the managing editor of the Washington Times. Yeah. Let's see, that was for in-depth reporting. And in 1994, Chris also received IWU's Harvey Beutner Award for journalistic excellence. So cheers for Harvey, right? All you Harvey people?
Hand out Harv.
Yeah, hand out Harv. And when I came to succeed Harv, I was called Harvey Beutner Jr. by the faculty. All right. Where was I? Yeah, okay. And after graduation, Chris became the very first IWU student to receive a Pulliam postgraduate fellowship. This is a big deal. It's awarded to the very best graduate and undergraduate student journalists in the country, including grad school, including those legendary journalism schools like Medill up at Northwestern, University of Missouri, and Columbia. And so Chris held his own. In my support letter for the Pulliam, I wrote, "If there is such a thing as Generation X, you couldn't prove it by Chris. He has a blue-collar work ethic and a record of accomplishments that makes other students look as if they're standing still or goofing off." I also wrote, at the Founders Day luncheon where Chris and I were seated at the same table with our president, that would be President Myers, and White House correspondent Helen Thomas, I was again reminded of how much Chris had matured as I watched him chat effortlessly with Ms. Thomas, which, by the way, neither one of us remembers. It is the first thing to go,
Yes.
right? I like to think it's because we both juggle so much in our lives, right? All right, I also wrote in that letter of recommendation, it took me back to a time when Chris was sports editor, and I had arranged for both of us to get press passes to the National Men's Fast Pitch Softball Tournament in Bloomington. Jack Brickhouse was the guest announcer, and Chris had talked about what a thrill it would be to get an interview. When we got there, he had to be goaded into leaving his seat on the bleachers and practically pushed into the announcer's box. But once in the door, he talked up a storm, so much so that Brickhouse had to say, well, son, I really have to get this game called. You know, he also got not just an interview, but a story about the very first broadcast fee that was ever paid to Illinois Wesleyan as a result of Brickhouse. Now, you remember the details of that, but I don't.
Yes.
So I didn't include it in my letter. And all of this has led him to where he is now, editor-in-chief at one of the largest papers in America. But there's just one other thing. Chris was the co-editor, along with the editor-in-chief at the time was Jennifer Burrell, and Chris was managing editor. And so they were saying, as students are apt to do at ICPA, oh, what are we going to do after graduation? What are we going to do after graduation? I said, you make your own breaks. I said, the Argus is having a centennial. Why don't you guys propose writing a book? They did. Minor Myers funded it. And I'll end my intro by reading Chris's inscription to me. This is my copy that I didn't realize I had until like moments ago. He says, Doc, thank you for making this entire book possible. As much as I complain, it was a pleasure working with you. Fusco. P.S. I still think you're nuts. Well, Chris, I think the same about you, but I really do admire you.
Thank you. Likewise.
Chris Fusco.
Now, Jim told a 99% accurate story there. He really pushed us to do the book, which is why I thought he was nuts. And I said, you're nuts for thinking that the two of us can do this. And so that's why I still thought he was nuts at the time. But we ended up getting it done after some very late nights with Jim supervising us in the basement of the old Sheehan Library, being there till 1:30 in the morning, some nights looking at old yellowing copies of 1800s Argusi, or however you want to say the plural, Arguses. So anyhow, I really appreciate the introduction, and obviously, you know, Jim pushing me into that booth at the softball tournament and interviewing Brickhouse was sort of a watershed moment for me, because it taught you how much fun this can be. And what we're going to be sort of going through is, today you're going to see how you get into it for the fun, you stay for the pain, and you keep doing what you're doing to preserve institutions. And I'm very proud of the one I work for, and you're going to see, you know, what I'm most proud of is that I think we acknowledge our triumphs, but we also acknowledge our shortcomings. So, and you'll see that a little bit in this presentation. So what I'm trying to do is use the Sun-Times as a little bit of a case study for where we're at in the industry of journalism. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the national studies that have been out there. We're going to talk a lot about the Sun-Times. We're going to talk how the newsroom's changed. We're going to talk a little bit about how the subscription model's changing, and then we're going to talk about how content feeds into all that. So, as if you're here, I'm assuming many of you read a newspaper, either online or in print, and it's not a pretty picture, especially in print. You know, daily circulation is down, Sunday circulation is down, huge. And if you look at the ad revenue, print and digital, sort of around 2000, late 90s, 2000, it peaked and has sort of just dropped off a cliff. Now the bottom line is circulation revenue. So while we've had declining circulation, the way we as an industry have made up for this is by basically raising the price of the paper, as you probably all are aware, to offset that ad revenue loss. The other thing that this chart doesn't reflect is paper prices. And paper prices have been going up. And you know, we've had to make painful decisions at the Sun-Times on things like comics, not only because Ziggy costs you quite a bit. He's pretty much a part-time employee, Ziggy is. But it's also the newsprint that we have to print Ziggy on that makes Ziggy all the more expensive. So what's the silver lining in the cloud? You know, digital circulation is increasing. What we're seeing is as our print readers are moving off into various places, some of them moving off into the great beyond, unfortunately, we can replace them with digital readers. And it's not just, I think, it's not just the fact that print readers are going away, but it's that there's so much more out there now. And I think even folks who are probably traditional print readers sit here and say, well, I want to get this, I want to get this, and now it's available to you, through your phone. So digital is up, and no company has done it better than the New York Times, to the point where they are willing to disclose their digital revenue, which is what many media companies are not doing. You're hearing a lot of media companies talk about their number of digital subscribers, but the key question is what's the revenue on that digital subscription rate? So at the New York Times, 3.3 million people paying for their digital products. This was their end of 2018. Online subscription revenue gained nearly 18% to reach $400 million in 2018, while digital advertising rose 8.6% to $259 million. They're able to do this because they are a national brand. And the era of Trump, regardless of what you think about the guy, has been great for the New York Times, because people will love read the New York Times because they hate Trump, or they will hate read the New York Times because they love Trump. And either way, the New York Times makes money. So, but 3.3 million people, so the challenge for those of us who are running regional brands like the Sun-Times or the Tribune, where my wife works, she's here too, she covers travel, so she can have a lot more interesting presentation. That's our challenge, is how do we replicate this model on a local level? The other ingredient in the mix that I don't think a lot of people are aware of is not-for-profit journalism. So as newsrooms have shifted, two newspaper towns have become one newspaper towns, with the exception of Chicago and a couple others. Not-for-profit folks are taking their buyouts from newsrooms and are simply getting laid off, and they are going to work for not-for-profit organizations that are now producing journalism that appears digitally on their own sites, but also gets shared with papers like mine. But the growth in this industry has been huge, and in fact, there's a whole institute now, a trade association for not-for-profit newsrooms. It has 209 members. By the end of 2018, Not-for-Profit News Network had a total estimated staff of nearly 3,000 people, 1,000 of them doing fundraising, and then about 2,000 of them being journalists. And those fundraising folks are generating significant money, $450 million in 2018. What's interesting about that $450 million is that some of those are corporations that have formed foundations that used to be advertising in print. So take a company like Ford. Ford used to buy car ads. Well, now the Ford Foundation is donating money to nonprofits to finance journalism. So it's changed the mix for us a little bit, and we'll get into it here in a bit, but I'm going to talk a little bit about that not-for-profit mix in Chicago later on and how that affects us. So when you look at the situation, you look at the number of two newspaper towns that are now one newspaper towns. Some towns are no newspaper towns. Youngstown, Ohio lost its only daily paper. It made some headlines a few months ago. Can newspapers stay alive? Should they? So this is my advertisement for newspapers. And I'm going to quote Dean McKay, a former Chicago Tribune reporter, actually, who's now the editor of the New York Times. There is no truer statement in my mind. The biggest crisis in the industry is the death of local regional journalism. We're going to reach a place where there will be whole states without journalism. And that is the rate at which we are sort of heading now, if we don't sort of figure out how to convert folks into more, I think, digitally minded readers. And there's other factors affecting this too that we'll go into. But there's another thing. I actually sat on the panel with one of the folks that did this study. He's from UIC, and this was a national study, part of the Brookings Institution Municipal Finance Conference. But this says it all. Local newspaper closures increase local government borrowing costs, and The study also found that local papers are especially important in states with low quality governments, and very important here, and that online media startup brands are not acting as sufficient substitutes for local papers. And I talked about this a little bit yesterday with the students. You know, we've come precipitously close in the past decade, multiple times, to the Sun-Times shutting down. And I cannot imagine, given this wave of news we have had this year about federal investigations of city hall, state government, county government, suburbs as small as ones that have 1,500 residents and their interconnectivity with state government. I can't imagine what the Chicago region would be like without a Sun-Times. It would just be, there's not as many eyeballs watching. And unless those eyeballs are there, it just doesn't bode well for us. So, and this study sort of backs it up. And the UIC professor that did this study, it was fascinating. He's a very interesting person, and but this is something that would play out not only in Chicago, but it's playing out nationally. So the reason I pulled this slide for sort of our case study is this sort of is our glimpse into the future. So there's your print cover, there's your phone, right? That's where we've been and where we're headed. And right now, I liken where we're at in journalism, not just at the Sun-Times, but we're doing the splits, right? And we got our digital foot moving this way and our print foot moving this way, and the audiences are sort of moving further apart. The resources that we need to do both products are significantly different. So as we do the splits, the question is after we do them, how do we sort of make that flat line work together where it's all joined together again? And one way we're doing it at the Sun-Times is we have signed a long-term partnership deal with Vox Media. Does anybody know what Vox Media is? If you know Vox, raise your hand. Very good, okay. So Vox operates a series of online brands, predominantly free ones. Vox.com is their flagship site. It's known for journalism explainers. It really takes a lot of what everybody else is reporting and sort of aggregates it into stories that people can explain. Axios, has anybody heard of Axios? Another site that does that through newsletters. They do it very similarly, but they have more of a robust newsletter business. But our website at the Sun-Times wasn't better than most college newspapers, and under new ownership, we were able to convince ownership to invest in sort of a world-class website. So when you go to suntimes.com now, it loads more quickly than most papers in the country. It's operating on the same platform as all the Vox Media sites. SB Nation is another big Vox Media site. And it's enabled Vox, the Deseret News in Salt Lake City is now operating on this platform. So what it's going to allow us to do, hopefully down the road, is more papers jump in and sign on to the Vox CMS. Maybe we can have shared advertising digitally across those platforms, and then all have some revenue share that way. So, but in the meantime, we're at least getting an experience that doesn't drive you backcrackers whenever you go onto our website. So in Chicago right now, we have a ton of stuff. Notice how much bigger that Sun-Times logo is than the Suburban logo. But, sorry, Warren. So we also have a ton of other stuff. So I sort of put, I don't know if you've heard of the brands on the second line, but ProPublica is sort of a national journalism not-for-profit. They are sort of the big dog right now. They're drawing a lot of money nationally. The Better Government Association is a local nonprofit that has been around since the 1800s that we've worked with on many stories in partnership with. Chalkbeat is a relatively new player, but they are national as well, and they cover all education. So they have a newsroom in Chicago, they have a newsroom in Denver, they have a newsroom in New York, again, all funded by donations. And then we've got sort of the brands that you've come to know over the years, Channel 9, WBBM, the Daily Herald, where both Lori and I worked before we worked at the Sun-Times, major suburban brand in Chicago. We're doing a lot of content sharing with the Daily Herald. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then there's sort of new startups, Real Deal, City Bureau, Block Club Chicago. Block Club's another not-for-profit. It's an outgrowth of a local news site that shut down called DNA Info. Anybody ever hear of DNA Info? Right, DNA Info was owned by Joe Ricketts. Ricketts' family owns the Cubs. Joe didn't really want to deal with the union workforce, so when DNA Info tried to unionize, Joe decided he was out the door. So they sort of reinvented themselves into grant funding as Block Club. So I'm going to just fly through this because I think most folks know this, but the point I want to make is most of the papers, the newspaper brands, are now behind paywalls, whether it's the Tribune, the Sun-Times, the Daily Herald. I'm not sure if some of the Shaw and other all the Trib Suburban titles are pretty much paywalled. I know here that we're, the Sun-Times, we try to punch above our weight a little bit. We're outnumbered staff-wise.
Definition of paywall.
Paywall is where you have to log in, you get so many articles for free. Good question, thank you. And anybody at any point here, if I get too industry speak, set me straight. You go onto our website and you start moving around between story to story. At some point, based on your usage level, and if you're a new user, it's pretty much 10 stories per month. At some point, we're going to ask you to start subscribing and for digital access. Various papers have these set at different levels. For us, we're set right now at 10 stories a month. So then we've got all the not-for-profits that we've talked about. Roughly a dozen not-for-profit newsrooms in Chicago right now. A lot of folks don't know that. We've got hyper-local journalism, Patch, Pioneer Press, even niche sites like Crime in Wrigleyville and Boys Town. They actually do a great job. It's a very small site focusing on just a couple neighborhoods, but it has pretty good readership for being hyper-local. No, Pioneer Press is the Evanston Review, the Skokie Life. The Reader is at the bottom here, so that's a weekly. We used to own the Reader at the Sun-Times. It broke off. It was able to be sold earlier this year. It's good for all of us that happened. So bottom line is there are a lot of media brands in the market. Some are paywalled, some are free. Same thing with TV. Just about all of the TV sites have their own text components to them. They're all free. They're not behind paywall. We got Channel 11. And we have two, basically the radio game for news. I mean, WGN is in there. WGN Radio is in there, but not really so much on a local reporting level. So the big players there are WBEZ, Chicago Public Media, and WBB, I'm sure.
Are any of the ethnic language, international language papers in Chicago still being printed?
There is still, I believe, a Polish language paper.
Okay.
There are a couple different competing Spanish language papers.
There used to be a couple dozen.
Yes, but that again is, times have changed and the advertising that used to be there to support those from those communities, those businesses have given way to other things. So we have fierce competition in the Chicago market. I would argue, even though we're not number one, we're not New York, we have just as many sort of competitive factors as that market does. But where we've fallen into in the internet era is a lot of coverage is overlapping. The way I sort of put it to folks is, it's sort of ironic, the biggest threat to good regional journalism is breaking news. And we'll sort of go into that now. So this is what we're sort of lacking in Chicago that we once had. Multiple reporters used to compete on beats, these things called beats. Now there are few, if any, reporters covering daily coverage of subjects. And I pulled this picture because there's sort of a lesson in journalism, write what you see, right? So what do you see there? You see downtown Chicago. You see lots of traffic. You see L tracks. You see tall buildings with multiple offices in them. Yet what is sort of fallen by the wayside? Reporting on transportation and infrastructure. We used to have a dedicated transportation reporter. We don't have it anymore. I finally was able to get a business and labor reporter back. We were cut to the point where we used to have a business staff of 3 or 4, and that got cut back to 0. So I've got a business reporter back. At a time when the environment is more important than ever, and environmental subjects are being debated and politicized and whatnot, there used to be multiple environmental reporters in Chicago. There's one at the Tribune now, and he largely focuses on environmental investigations. There's no day-to-day coverage of the environment. Lori, in one of her previous lives, was one of 2 health reporters at the Sun-Times covering consumer health. That beat's gone at both papers. There's still some business health reporting going out there, but not consumer health. Both papers used to have a religion reporter. Chicago, huge Catholic town, tremendous scandals involving priest sex abuse, clergy sex abuse. That used to be the religion person's beat, not anymore. We used to have dedicated reporters to child welfare, social services, public housing, incredibly complex topics involving incredible amounts of public money, your money. We used to have reporters dedicated to covering these beats. They're gone. They're gone everywhere across the country. So that sort of takes us to my shop, right? Roger's up in the corner there, looking out at all of us, thank heaven. But you know, I feel this is important. Whenever I try to talk to people about the Sun-Times, I try to remind them that, you know, this is where we came from. You know, we were a national force, and Roger's a big reason for that. You know, you look at the history. I mean, I love the logo up top with the picture newspaper. And of course, many years later, we were the newspaper that under 2 ownership groups ago famously fired all of its photographers. And we're still dealing with the aftershocks of that. You know, we were there when the Bears won the Super Bowl, you know, shuffling the title. You know,
it's always been the best format, Chris.
Thank you.
Because you're sitting on the bus or the train and you open it up and it's
Right.
portfolio likeness, and then your neighbor with the Tribune folding.
That's right. Thank you. But the problem is this is a pretty good format too, you know, and that's the problem. And then of course I just threw in, you know, sort of at the bottom, you know, our Vox Media Sun-Times partnership is sort of the future of where we're headed. So I want to talk a little bit about our newsroom and sort of how it's set up. You've got your beat reporters, which are, you know, we've got our political city hall, we've got all our sports beats covered, we've got business labor, we've got consumer affairs, you know, local is our bread and butter, and we're trying to get those things back. And in my sort of strategic plan, all of those beats that you saw on, you know, on the board earlier, I'm trying to get those back, you know, so, and it's a function of trying to get the revenue in the door to make that happen. But there's also new sections of the newsroom. There's a whole audience team. You know, newsletters like the one Axios puts out, those are sort of the new front page for national news. We're going to need to do that on a local level. We are doing it, but we want to improve them. You know, social media outreach is important, optimizing your headlines so that keywords are in the right places and in the URL structure at the top of an internet screen. That's important. So we have to have a dedicated group of people now, dedicated to just taking the content we produce and optimizing it for electronic distribution. Sports used to be a night side game. They call in the scores. You get there. We got to put together the Agate page and all that stuff. That's not the way anymore. We have to be producing sports, you know, stories during the day when people are reading. Because now, after they watch the game, they go to bed. You know, visual journalists. It's not just photography anymore. A photographer has to also know video really well. And frankly, reporters have to know iPhone basics of shooting video. You know, we have a 24/7 breaking news desk at the Sun-Times that provides copy to the TV stations that pay us for it. That's a big part of what we do. And then we have a whole digital strategy department that we're building. Because at some point, our business becomes sort of a math problem. We need to follow the data like reporters follow the money. And the more data we can amass about our readers, the more we know what they want. We can figure out a cost of acquiring a digital subscriber. So that's the next step for us. And that's frankly when you see why the New York Times has 3.3 million digital readers, they've done the homework. So really quick, local matters for us. This is our bread and butter. If we post a story about the impeachment process on our website, we're going to get drowned out by the New York Times. If we try to find creative ways to use those stories. So maybe instead of focusing on the Trump impeachment story of the day, we'll try to post the full transcript of the hearing, right? Because maybe some of the other brands won't do that. But for us, something like the Laquan McDonald shooting and the Jason Van Dyke trial, this is an example where we blew it out, and this is sort of our future on things. It's not just a story in the paper. We created special digital section. We had profiles of the people involved. We had key documents from the trial posted if you wanted to read trial docs. We did a look ahead post every morning. There would be a new story, what's coming today online. We had an editor on site who called the shots for a team of reporters. We had a reporter dedicated to just working our social media feeds, putting out one sentences linking back to a running story that we were doing throughout the day. So if you're at work and you wanted to follow the trial, but you couldn't have it on TV, you could have your little running story and we would be updating basically like a live blog. And we got 750,000 page views, time on page, 4 minutes and 30 seconds is sort of unheard of in our industry. So that shows people were checking in a lot. And then, our average on the site is 212 if you're just browsing homepage, articles, all that stuff. So the key is to sort of now figure out, when we have that paywall that we were talking about earlier, what are people reading where they want to convert? And a great example of this is for the Dallas Morning News. They've been sort of cutting edge on this. These are sort of they found that the Cowboys, the Rangers, colleges, and high schools got them up to 26,000 paid digital subscribers. We're sort of seeing the same thing. We're starting to get this funnel of things. And what's interesting about the things that convert, they're not necessarily the things that draw the most page views. So like that Mark Brown column up there about, Pat Arbor, who's this kind of scoundrel business person in Chicago.
I happen to have the Dallas Morning News online, but it's almost impossible on it to change from topic to topic.
Yeah.
They need to do a better job of that.
Yeah, well, now do you get their newsletter is the question.
Newsletter?
Yeah, their morning newsletter.
No.
See, and so we'll get into that a little bit.
Okay.
The newsletter's sort of the new front page, and that's gonna help you curate, that's where we can do the same thing that we're doing on the front page. But like our columnists, for as much effort, we've got some great ones still. Mark Brown, Mary Mitchell recently quasi-retired, but we've still got her at the pen. We've got Lynn Sweet in Washington. She's all over CNN. We've got some high-profile people. They don't necessarily draw the same kind of traffic that, say, in R. Kelly, when R. Kelly gets pinched, for something, the board lights up. We get thousands of page views on that story. But we don't get a lot of conversions out of it, people being willing to pay to subscribe to us digitally. What does get us people willing to subscribe, the bears, our columnists, we found business converting, crime for better or for worse, everyday crime stories, if you're on top of what's going on in people's neighborhoods, that converts. So again, we're trying to bring our beat structure back, and our overarching strategy is you have to have a mix. If you don't do a variety of things, the recipe is death. So, we are working on our newsletter strategy. We have a Bears newsletter that's going to be debuting next week. Basically, what we've done with the Bears is they're sort of our prototype, I think, with where we're going. We have 3 reporters covering the Bears. It is by far our most important beat at the paper, given the traffic it produces and the conversions it provides. But what we're doing is we have components. We have your Bears, we have a sponsor for our Bears coverage in the paper. Plumbers 911 sponsors our Bears coverage in the paper. They have their ads on all of our Bears articles that are online. They are the sponsor of our Bears podcast, which we've done about 20-something episodes, and we've got about 26,000 downloads. So we're averaging pretty good numbers on the podcast, building an audience there. And then they're also going to sponsor the Bears newsletter. So if we could sort of find this new model of sponsorship, much the way the not-for-profits are drawing foundations to come in and support them, there are certain content areas where we know we can provide a really good value between our print circulation and digital and podcasting ears. One of our podcasts, and I would really encourage you, if you listen to podcasts, if you don't, it's sort of a, if you're in the car, podcasts are great. If you're driving back to Dallas, do a search on your phone and look for Motive. Motive is a podcast that we're doing in conjunction with WBEZ, Chicago Public Radio, or Chicago Public Media, I should say. And so one of our reporters is a Pulitzer Prize winner, Frank Main. He has been following the story of a young man who was convicted of murder at age 13. He was locked up. It was eventually determined that he was wrongfully convicted. He served nearly 15 years in prison. He was let free, given a $25 million settlement, and is now back in prison. So this is the story of Thaddeus TJ. And then as we're 3 episodes in, this is an example of something like when I got the Bears guy doing their podcast, we don't need WBEZ, right? This is 3 guys sitting around after a game, intro, outro, talking Bears football. A podcast like this, we knew we don't have the capacity to do this on our own. Every sound, every piece of music, every clip, and the way the audio was recorded. So what do? We went out and found a partner. And now this is probably by far, this is our most successful podcasting project to date. And it's only 3 episodes in, and there's going to be 10 total, and it's riveting. We are running some of the not-for-profit partners' content. I run ProPublica Illinois Stories. I've got a good relationship with them, the BGA. Occasionally, we even put one of our reporters with one of their reporters and let them go to town. Sports Saturday. Saturday newspapers are dying in one market town. Newspapers go to one edition. On the table over there, you'll find some of them. We are trying an experiment, and so far it's working in terms of ad revenue, where we took, we make the Saturday edition Sports Saturday. That's my cool shirt here. Really told me I look like a football coach this morning, but I'm not big enough to do that. So we're taking that product. It's typically 48 pages of sports, kind of Sports Illustrated style, magazine style reads. 3,000 word cover story. If you're a Cubs fan, the Sports Saturday that I brought down is all about what's next for the Cubs. We actually took one of our marketing department designers, a woman, and brought her into the newsroom, and she has brought a whole new, when you look through it, it's basically like a magazine on newsprint. And speaking of magazines, we also do those too. We do about 6 to 8 magazines a year that we insert into the paper. We've got our Bears preview there, Auto Chicago, Summer Guide, Made in Illinois. These are all topics that, all products that we charge a little bit more for at the newsstand and to home delivery subscribers. Yes, there has been a blowback when you charge somebody a little more, but I feel like the quality of the content that we've provided, we haven't seen decreases in circulation because of this. We actually have had some gains in single copy circulation on these days when we do topics that are very hot, e.g. the Bears. Standalone video is still part of what we're doing. It is not by any means our bread and butter. We went through 2 video experiments at the Sun-Times, video only. They went through it at the Tribune. A lot of newspapers have tried thinking that video is going to be the salvation to our business. But what we found is that video behind a paywall doesn't really work when people can get all sorts of free video on TV and on the TV websites. And finally, we do have content that's underwritten. We are transparent about it, but advertisers will say, hey, could I sponsor a series of profiles about labor, about healthcare, or whatever? So we will sell ad adjacencies and note that certain profiles are underwritten by advertisers. So that said, we're going to get a sales pitch at the end here. So we are offering, and this is if you go to suntimes.com, IWU, it'll take you to, we have a bunch of different subscription offers. You have unlimited access to our website. We're offering it for $30 a year right now. That's the best deal, and there's a bunch of other things on there. If you want to come back to print, we're happy to take you there too. There's some great deals for print. But we're trying to rebuild ourselves back into a regional news brand. And We're lucky we've had some investment this year. Rocky Wirtz, owner of the Blackhawks, came in as an investor. Michael Sachs came in as an investor. He heads GCM, which is a major global investment firm based out of Chicago. And we have obviously we have labor union backing, so it's a pretty diverse group. Go ahead.
You said earlier there was a big difference in resources between digital and print. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so like years ago, we wouldn't have needed this audience team, right? All these things that we need to do for digital really becomes a very labor-intensive process because it's not just the story anymore. It's the story, it's the photo, it's where you're gonna put it on that homepage in real time. Then it's what do you have to do on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram? What are you doing on Google? It's looking at the analytics. Is it underperforming? How's this Facebook, how's this headline? We do a lot of A/B testing of headlines. So which headline is working better? Then we have to go in. So it's a tremendous strain on resources. And these are resources that used to be being put into beat reporting. So, but you have to do it.
By way of comparison, $29.99 sounds like a real bargain. What's a print annual subscription cost?
I mean, print varies. I mean, but I mean, if you let's say you were going to go out and buy the newspaper every day at the newsstand, and we still do a big single copy business. The price of our paper is $1. The Tribune at the newsstand is $2.50. The Daily Herald, even, which is about half the size we are, is $1.50. If you were going to buy the newspaper every day, it'd be about $450 a year.
Sunday edition's a little more. Sunday
edition's $2 for us, and I think $3 for the Tribune. So, and I'm not sitting here faulting the Tribune. We're all doing what we have to do, and the Tribune does have greater depth than we do in entertainment, culture, all those things. We know, and believe me, I'd like to get back there too. But first, I want my transportation report. Not everybody votes, but they drive or they take the train or they fly. So, any other questions?
How many stories, let's say, do you get for $29.99? You're not getting the whole paper, are you?
You're getting more than actually what's in the paper. We produce between wire content and staff-produced content, we produce about 80 to 100 individual articles go online a day. News, sports, entertainment, and a lot of that doesn't make the paper. Not necessarily because it's not worthy of being in the paper, time of day, right? If big news breaks in the morning, sometimes by the end of the day, that story is irrelevant and doesn't belong in the paper anymore.
What about ads? So the grocery ads or those kinds of, does that eliminate your access of knowledge?
Well, we're trying to get, you're highlighting our challenge, right? Because while grocery advertisers will still occasionally do an insert, and we have a food section on Wednesday called Taste, and we have some grocery ads in that's a part of the business that really hasn't translated very well over to digital. And it's because it's hard, right? Nobody wants to read listings of this is what your prime grade A, sirloin costs. But there's something about that. And if you put that print ad up, we also do an e-paper, by the way. So a lot of our wiser readers, so to speak, they still like a paper. They retire, they go to Florida, they get the e-paper. They still see those things. So it's a digital replica of what we're producing for print. So it's
Thursday is still like the sale paper day though, right? There were always inserts in Thursday
yes.
paper.
But those inserts have it's difficult. We've got direct mail we're competing against, right? And it's, the buying patterns among my generation on down, millennials, whatnot, they see see things differently. I mean, when you go through the grocery store now, how many folks do you see shopping for other people that have ordered their stuff online? You're starting to see that in Chicago.
Two questions. One is just a simple one, I think. So that an e-copy is pictures of a printed paper.
Exactly.
As opposed to your online.
Exactly.
Different, okay. I think it was your very first slide. Digital readership or subscriptions increased 6 and 8% daily as weekend or Sunday.
Yes.
And print decreased 12 and 13% respectively. What's the base number on those two? Is that the same base all combined, or 6% of what number and 12%.
Yeah, and I pulled that off Pew. I don't have the base numbers on that. I mean, I can tell you, the numbers are pretty astounding. I mean, from where we were in the Chicago market. I mean, just to give you a base example, our Sunday Sun-Times used to probably have about 600,000 readers 30 years ago. We're down to about 100,000 now in Sunday circulation. So, in print.
And your online is up to?
Online, we're at about, please don't tweet this. We're at about, 15 million page views a month on suntimes.com. We do about 1 million to 2 million more on Apple News. And then we do additional page views on our app, which is a whole other story. News apps are sort of this weird black hole for all of us right now. The Tribune's got a good one, the New York Times is a good one. Ours isn't very good, so I don't like to talk about it very much, but that's a whole other. But there's different ways that people are getting to us. Some get through Apple News, right? Because they're reading a bunch of different things on Apple News and we're in their feed there. So the question then becomes, whether it's Google, Apple News, a lot of people get to our stories through Facebook. How do we start to convince these folks to give us a bigger share of the pie? Because they have to at some point be thinking that if we're not here, they're not here, right? And they've so far been, basically cannibalizing off us. And at some point, you could see the government getting involved, but I don't really want to think about that.
I subscribe to our local newspaper, and I'm a former editor, not of a newspaper, but I'm really disturbed by the grammar mistakes, the spelling mistakes,
Absolutely.
the punctuation mistakes. And I was on a local newspaper advisory board and got to know the editor, and I kept sending her emails, and finally she just got sick of me, pointing out the grammar mistakes in the headlines on the front page.
Yeah.
And don't they proofread anymore, or don't reporters study grammar?
So, well, it's a little bit of each, and I'll be bluntly honest with you. The resources that used to go into having a copy editor or a proofreader, just somebody who wouldn't even edit. There used to be so many steps to the process that a story would get 7 or 8 sets of eyeballs before it would get pasted onto that page. That number of eyeballs is now basically down to 2 or 3, and it is. The New York Times there was a big deal this year. The New York Times is getting rid of its copy editing desk. And it is a sort of a watershed moment. They're joining the land that we have been in for a long time. I'm hoping when you pick up those products, I'll give you my card. I want you to email me if you see anything. We're really trying, but it is a reality of where it is, and it's also a reality a little bit of, I think, that just the next generation of journalists, because they've been taught more multimedia skills, they're just not as great at the writing part of it. And the resources that used to go into proofreading and copy editing are now going into having to push out breaking news on digital. So it's not fun for us. And frankly, I think a lot of publishers, they just kind of thought when they were laying off these positions, well, it's all going to be digital anyway. And print hasn't died. That's sort of this weird, we're still doing the splits. And I think a lot of publishers thought, well, it's going to die anyway, and then we'll just fix the mistakes online as we see them, right? And it turns out that there's still something about print that's hanging on. And it might, John Lampin, my old editor at the Daily Herald, he has a great line. He's like, print needs to become the new vinyl, right? You're going to have this sort of affinity for print that maybe it actually somehow hangs around, and you'll just pay a lot of money for it.
Yeah, if you go
to this website, the app, your app.
Apps, they operate, the app goes, but this will take you to, my preferred way that I hope you would access us is just go to suntimes.com. Punch in suntimes.com in your browser. It's going to get you a top-notch digital experience. It's going to get you links to all of our videos. It's going to help you find our podcasts, or just Google our stories. Google Sun-Times Lori Lightfoot, and that's going to get you to our site, and you can start browsing around from there.
If you go to the long history of newspapers, just daily papers, there was a time when you had morning and afternoon and evening edition. I mean, this updating thing isn't all new. Some papers had 2 editions.
Right, right.
Most of us now that read 1 or 2 daily papers are glad to get it once a day, as early in the morning as possible. But how often do you have to update all these digital formats?
This is a 24, this is a living, this
I mean,
is a
it's
living.
constant.
It's constant, yeah, and it's a living, breathing organism. I mean, there are people, you know, at my shop right now, at the Tribune. I woke up this morning, I got a news alert about a 9-year-old boy being shot on the south side of Chicago. I mean, as soon as it happens, we need to push it out there. And what I tell my staff is, and sometimes we're successful, sometimes we're not, but the way the Google algorithm sort of works is, a great example, R. Kelly, we were the first in the world to report the new Cook County criminal charges against R. Kelly. We had gotten a tip on it. This is actually a great story about little old-fashioned reporting and new-fashioned reporting coming together. We got a tip, everybody's looking around, we're calling people, and our crime guy at our office tells our courts guy, hey, go punch R. Kelly's name into the court computer and see if anything pops up. The docket, very good. Sure enough, there it is. So Sam Charles is across the newsroom, the 3 of us, myself, the managing editor, and another editor in the newsroom trying to figure out who we got to call to confirm this, because we know it's going to be huge. So Sam shouts across the newsroom, it's in the docket. And I shout back at him, 1 sentence, right, 1 sentence. R. Kelly has been criminally indicted by a Cook County grand jury on account of blah. Put that out there, get it online, get it posted, get it alerted, and then you just watch the page views. And then you have to keep building the story. So the algorithm recognizes that the Suntimes.com was first. So now anybody who's searching R. Kelly is going to start to see, and then, I mean, by the end of the day, you know, on a normal day, you'll see about 2,000 to 3,000 and 2,000 people reading our site at one time. Just on that R. Kelly story alone, there were 8,000 people reading that story at one time. Because we kept feeding it then. We kept making the algorithm happy.
Yeah, and you can coordinate between newspapers and digital with cable news. I watch the MSNBC, and I'm getting New York headlines and stories, leads at least, and breaking news.
Right.
Before, and I know that's what I'm going to read in my Times the next morning.
Yeah, yeah.
Give me a little more information. Decreased local journalism gives increased borrowing costs.
Yeah, yeah. So what they did is they looked at places that had lost their local papers, and then they looked at the borrowing deals that were being cut on things like school referendums, borrowing for water and sewer projects, and then they started looking at the interest rates that government was paying. And what they found was those interest rates were going higher, and government was spending more money in places where there weren't reporters there to write about those deals. So if you go to the Brookings Institution, if you Google Brookings Institution local media borrowing costs, you can read the whole study. It's pretty interesting. And again, just like any academic study, there have been folks that have attacked, you know, there's all kinds of criticism on, you know, it can be critiqued one way or another. But the bottom line is I don't think you can argue that the world's going to be a better place with less local media keeping an eye on government. I like to, and it's funny, like, and it's pretty much spanned my career. I started at the Northwest Herald in Crystal Lake, Illinois, not far from Dave Gathman, who was working at the Elgin Courier. And at the time, both of our papers probably had 30,000 circulation, roughly. Yeah, I think we're at about
35,000.
yeah, 35. So I would go to a Lake in the Hills village board meeting, a very small town in McHenry County where development was happening. How many reporters do you think were at the Lake in the Hills village board meeting? 5. This is 1995. Elgin Courier, Daily Herald, Northwest Herald, Chicago Tribune, Stringer, Pioneer Press. 5 reporters covering a village board meeting. Now how many reporters cover the city council meeting in Chicago, right? Every committee meeting, it's us and the Tribune, you know, and if it's a big deal. But those suburban meetings, you know, go largely uncovered. And so what can those governments get away with by not having eyeballs on them?
One particularly interesting example of that, there's a village of Gilbert's, it's, you know, had like 1,000 people. In fact, I think you were involved in that too, you said.
Yep, you and I were out there together.
And used to have one of my regular beats that cover every village board meeting. They had a proposal from this developer, literally wanted to triple the size of the village. He wanted to put it in this subdivision, which would contain 2,000 people. And we wrote story after story about that. Most of these meetings, maybe like 3 or 4 people from the village would come and attend it. All of a sudden, someone started spreading the word that this is going on. This is months into the process. So all of a sudden, we showed up at a village board meeting, and there were 100 people in the room. They said, "Why didn't you tell us about this?" So the village president asked me to put together a list of all these front page stories. If you got it right here, we'll pull paper. And
Yeah, and now
people just
that's,
aren't as interested in that as there and things like that.
yeah.
One of the things that I remember, I'm Dave's wife, by the way, but one of the things that the local historian in Elgin used to say, and I worked at the library, he said, "I'm really scared if the Courier goes out of business, or the Daily Herald, how do you find out about local elections?" I'm not talking about the state or the, you know, that level, but the Elgin City Council, the library board, the school board. There's not many other places to find that information.
Right, and I think what's gonna end up happening is you're gonna start to see, I mean, you're seeing it now a little bit in, you know, there's a big federal investigation going on, there's a lot of interconnectivity between, you know, the State House, City of Chicago government, lobbyists, and it's creeping into the suburbs, places like McCook, Summit, they're all getting raided by the feds. Well, those are also places that don't have a lot of media scrutiny, right? So I think what you're gonna start to see at the local level as local journalism sort of goes under, you're gonna see village boards that come in, it's gonna be easy for them to be co-opted, and the next thing you know, there's gonna be people wondering, well, why didn't they know? Well, they didn't know because the local paper did.
Who does research on that kind of information, and also who does research on where have readers gone who've dropped from print journalism? Have they gone to online journalism, or they've dropped out of news, or
I
who
think
does those kind of studies?
the number one, I mean, I don't know of a lot of studies on that. I can tell you anecdotally that people get frustrated with the paper, the size of the paper. The print reader says it's not worth my time anymore. And, you know, oftentimes they are probably a Trump supporter. And, you know, or they're angry. I mean, you know, we try to be equal opportunity. I mean, the editorial board aspect, which I also have a role in, creates a different dynamic, right? You've got the news, you've got your columnists who have their opinions, and you have the opinion of the newspaper. And I oversee the editorial board, and, you know, one of the things I've tried to do is be very aware of sort of how our opinion, I think opinion deserves being out there on the front page when we have a strong one. When we endorsed Lori Lightfoot for mayor, we put her on the front page with that endorsement, because this was to me, this was a time in our city's history where we need to make a strong statement about what we stand for. And in a field of 14 mayoral candidates, one of them being a Daley, which would have, you know, taken us back to the past, we felt that was really important. That endorsement had legs. It was actually just written about in a Gateway Journalism Review article, sort of crediting us for turning the election, which is pretty cool. That said, we have union ownership, right? And this past week, we had an editorial. We came out very strongly, despite being a union-owned paper, we came out against the Chicago Teachers Union. We think that a 16% raise over 5 years is plenty. And we put out a front page editorial, much like we did Lori Lightfoot, that said Chicago Teachers Union, take the deal. So that's an example of we're trying to show our independence, right? Like, even though we're union owned and tend to be a pro-union paper, pro-labor paper, we're going to take, you know, whatever, even though our editorial board's opinion has been sort of against the President of the United States, we run conservative columnists that have opposite opinions. So Can't make everybody happy all the time.
So, as the business has changed, and maybe faculty can address this too, your new hires, are they tech-savvy kids willing to write news, or are they journalism majors who know how to use tech?
It's a little bit of all of the above. So I don't think the kids that are coming out now generally, and this is the whole spectrum, not Wesleyan kids or not Medill kids, whatever. We get a young person in our newsroom, they know how to use this pretty well, they know how to do stuff very quickly. What they lack is the attention to detail that I think my generation had. And the problem with that is that there's nobody there to backstop them. And so it becomes a very difficult proposition. And where they often end up in my world is we have that 24/7 breaking news desk that has overnight shifts. And that's where, so we put 2 of them on there so they can read each other and make sure, try to do the best job they can overnight, because that's the graveyard shift. But here's the positive part of this, is if I see a kid willing to work that shift for 6 months, 8 months, a year, that shows me that they're serious about doing this. And all the other stuff can be taught, but it takes time, and it takes people, and it takes resources, it takes readers.
I live in Seattle now, and one of the things that happens in Seattle with respect to local news online is a neighborhood blogging. So there's something called the West Seattle blog, the B-Town blog, which is the Burien paper, or the Burien blog. And what we get there are, it's really surface stuff, right? It's, you heard an ambulance 15 minutes ago, or you heard a fire truck go by, this is what's going on. Or there was just an accident on the West Seattle Bridge and there's a 3-mile backup, right? So, I mean, very sort of, or such and such a meeting is going to take place next Wednesday. So it's not journalism in the sense that you've been talking about it, but it is information.
Right, and people, you know, and there's lessons that we need to learn from that. I mean, people want it all, you know, whereas before it used to be just journalism, now they want everything. And we'll do news alerts in the morning, 2 lanes of the Dan Ryan backed up, you know, crash on the Dan Ryan. You know, Metro service delayed by a person hit on the tracks.
But are there neighborhood blogs in Chicago?
Yeah, there's Nextdoor. I mean, Nextdoor is a popular
Yeah,
one.
I've got, Nextdoor's in Seattle too.
Yeah.
I mean, the West Seattle blog. You know, it's people living in West Seattle who tell each other about stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And they continue the conversation. You know, the thing that where you start to get, though, like, what happens if that conversation starts getting a little nasty between people?
It's mad.
Right? And that's the other part. Bob had a question.
No,
we're getting on time.
I just want to be respectful of your time.
Oh,
I've attended lots of these. I've never heard as many questions. Never.
Well, it's great. I mean, I'm glad folks are still engaged in the news.
How about 1, maybe 2 questions?
You think news media in general, and specifically newspapers, were able to remain neutral? You talk about independence. It seems to me like you read 1,500 newspapers, they just, without shame, combine opinion and facts constantly. You had the ultra-democrat and the Geneva Republic.
Right.
That seemed like most of the 20th century, that kind of a golden age. There was a wall between the editorial side and the reporting side.
Yeah, I think that's more common in TV than it's going to be in newspapers.
It seemed like Fox News kind of came forward.
Well, Fox News set the new.
It was a tremendous success by being just on one side. Now CNN's pretty much converted the other direction.
Right, and MSNBC is maybe a little bit further to the left of, and that's where eventually America is going to have to sort of wake up and realize when it turns on those channels, a lot of it is the echo chamber. Right, and stuff does creep in, and those shows are all sort of cast in a way where, is Don Lemon a journalist? Is he a reporter? Or is he an anchor? Or is he a columnist? Right, sort of, you know, and that's where we all have to sort of decide for ourselves.
Chris, how have you covered the China story from a Chicago perspective? I mean, you have soybean farmers nearby, you have Boeing, and the 737 MAX is still sitting on the ground. Would have been a great way to solve the trade deficit issue.
Yeah.
Now it's a lost opportunity. So I'm wondering if you ever take a story like that and sort of cover it from the angle of Chicago and Chicago's relationship with China.
Well, you're just giving me a great story. But we finally have a business and labor reporter back who once a week he is sort of trying to dive into those subjects. Like he did a column, and we're giving him one column, news analysis column a week. So a story like that he did was looking at Uber, Lyft, sort of this renaissance of the old Main post office in Chicago, the companies that are in it, and sort of all the ways that those companies are still losing money, yet being, buying enormous amounts of warehouse and office space and adding employees. And can they really be, are we just sort of looking at the next tech bubble as we convert the old Main post office? Is it really this great thing that everybody thinks it is? So that would be something that he would, I'm hoping that we can have him jump into. But the short answer is we use wire copy. I mean, we still have to be a general interest newspaper, and the bottom line is that wire copy isn't going to generate a lot of digital readership for us. What's going to generate that readership is the raids at that Suburban office in McCook. All right, well, I'm going to, if anybody's any other questions, come on up. Thank you very much.